I'm going to be talking to Nicholas Fulgham, who's a senior data analyst at Ember Energy, which is a global think tank. And we're going to be talking about China's electricity demand. So welcome to the interview, Nick.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm fascinated by this because it seems that we have now the emergence of two superpowers, China, which is in a geopolitical struggle with the United States. But China has clearly chosen electricity as its energy future, and it's rapidly growing supply in its power grid. Lots of wind and solar, but also some additional hydro and nuclear. But it's really the demand side here that I think, and I call this the real revolution of the energy transition, because we could always make electricity. We've done that for 125 years, but we couldn't electrify transportation. We couldn't electrify economically building heating and cooling. We couldn't electrify industrial processes. Now we can, and we're getting better and better and better at it. It's now, in most cases, the the low cost, best performing option for, if you're whatever technology you require. Is that a fair way of describing the technological context for this discussion around China?
Yeah, so there's basically two trends going on. So China has obviously had a massive increase in demand, not just in the electricity sector, but in the whole energy sector. And this electricity and energy needs to come from somewhere. And historically, on the supply side, it was an increase in coal, an increase in oil. Like you said, we always knew how to produce electricity. This is not something new. And actually, the rate of demand growth hasn't really changed dramatically in recent years. So even before wind and solar were sort of the big drivers of change, even before that, we had this level of electricity growth in China. So that's not the new thing. The new thing is that now we're producing electricity in a different way. And it's not just affecting the power sector itself, it's affecting every single part of the energy economy. And that includes transport, it includes industry. And we're really turning a corner where total fossil fuel demand has plateaued.
Yeah, I think in the power sector, coal is down to about 51% of the fuel mix, and gas is 3%, and solar and wind, I forget the percentage, but much higher than it was 5 years ago. But I want to pick up on something you said, which is that the change in supply has also affected how China uses that electricity on the demand side in transportation and industry. Could you explain that, please?
Yeah, so historically, outside of the power sector, if you just look at transport, if your car fleet grows, your truck fleet grows, then your consumption for oil naturally grows with that. There's obviously some efficiency gains with more efficient internal combustion engines that have happened over the last 30 years, but both those efficiency gains are fizzling out, and actually increase in the fleet is making up for that. So from that perspective, you would expect a continued increase in oil demand. But what's happening now is that we have this process of electrification. So functions in sectors outside the power sector that were previously performed by fossil fuels are now being performed by electricity. Now, of course, we could talk about where that electricity comes from. As I said, increasingly wind and solar as well. But crucially, within the transport sector, when you switch from an ICE vehicle to an EV, you're directly reducing your oil consumption. And that's meant that over the last 2, 3 years, oil consumption in the transport sector has flattened out. We've seen coal consumption in industry also reduce. And even in buildings for things like heating, etc., the use of gas is increasing at a much slower rate and has actually flattened out as well a little bit. And all of this is exactly the same trend in all three of those sectors. It's that electricity is taking up a larger share of energy there.
Well, let's talk about the electrification of transportation, because even though that's still a modest part of electricity demand in China, it's growing very rapidly. And it's not just cars and trucks. That's the thing that is often lost in this conversation. It's buses, school buses, transit buses. It is medium duty vehicles. It is two and three wheelers, which are huge in China. I think it was 1.4 billion of them. Now they're 43% electrified. I mean, it's like if it moves, it's going to be electric. It seems to be the trend.
Absolutely. And China has also set itself up quite well for a rapid electrification progress. Transport means are not 100% interchangeable, but to a degree, there is some, you can shift road transport onto rail, for example. And China's rail system is highly electrified. That means that any transport that moves to rail or any passenger transport, freight transport is directly electrified if it comes from previously an ICE vehicle. So in addition to all of the breadth of the road transport network that you already mentioned, there's the rail transport network very much falls into that, and China is very much a global front runner on electrifying that part of its transport system as well. So it really plays into the hands of a rapidly electrifying economy as well.
I don't know if you have any information on this, but I watched a video the other day. It was a press conference where there was a high-speed train in China, and it went like 500 kilometers an hour. And it was the blink of an eye, and it zipped by the reporters, and everybody was agog. Nobody had ever seen anything that fast. Was that accurate? I mean, are we seeing that speed of high-speed rail?
Yeah, and oftentimes these like instances of sort of um, extreme records being performed are more indicative of more gradual underlying developments. And the underlying development in this case is that China's rail transport sector is one of the most developed ones in the entire world. Um, just to compare, the UK obviously is, which is one of the oldest rail sectors in the world, still has a reasonable amount of lines that aren't electrified. So there's no overhead wiring. That means that trains have to switch back to diesel generators. Some trains move on like a two-way system where they have both diesel generators or both diesel um, and electric connection on board to propel themselves. But yeah, China is very much a very highly electrified rail transport system, and that means that any expansion in that system is also very much moving forward with that technology, and is not requiring any additional fossil fuel use.
Here's one that I find really interesting, and that is electrification across the economy, but including industrial processes, because industrial processes require heat. And for a long time, creating heat with electricity was very expensive compared to coal or gas, but it's not anymore. And we've got all sorts of new technologies, like electric furnaces and electric heat batteries and so on. Is China at the forefront of both the development and the adoption of those technologies?
Yeah, so when it comes to clean power technologies or clean energy technologies, China is leading the world in patents filed. And this is not just patents that people in the past have criticized as being they're there for discussions about intellectual theft, but these are patents that are also filed in the West. So China is very much leading on the development. The level of investment into new technologies is higher than almost anywhere else in the world. Obviously, at the same time, we have a retreat in the hard sciences by the US. The current government is very much, even though they may say that they're in support of technology, open technology development, very much the numbers on research grants tell a slightly different story. Whereas China has already taken that push into research into implementation. We can see that in more established sectors. So whether it's the production and export of solar panels, where China is very much the market leader, over 80, close to 90% of global solar panel export capacity is in China. Whether it's heat pump production, whether it's hydrogen capacity. So even a sector that is like kind of slow to get off the ground. China is leading here as well and has more than half of the world's green hydrogen capacity. So whatever clean power or clean energy sector you want to look at, China is right there in the middle of it, and oftentimes makes up more than half of the world's resources on that sector. So it's very much a if you want to call it like a clean energy juggernaut.
Final electricity use grew 65% between 2015 and 2023. So we know that there are more electrical devices being connected to the grid that are being used. But what percentage does electricity account for in the primary energy demand for the country?
So we always look at two different metrics here. So one is the primary energy demand, which is all of the resources that actually go into energy production. So that's all of the coal, all of the oil, and then you oftentimes scale up renewables because wind and solar don't actually have material fuel inputs. And there, um, wind and solar, for example, still make up a smaller share, but that doesn't actually reflect the role that wind and solar and then electricity wider as a wider part of the energy system actually plays. So that's why we look at the other metric, and that's final energy consumption. And this is the consumption that actually produces a useful output, essentially. So, and here electricity is rising rapidly and is now above 30% of final energy consumption. Now, within electricity, obviously, you still have coal use and you have gas use, but that is a sector that can be switched over to clean sources already. Whereas in the rest of the economy, so the fossil fuel powered side of the final energy consumption, that is the side that still is in the process of being electrified. But yeah, the rate of electrification, as you would call it, has reached over 30%. And with that, China is very much also a front runner and is well ahead of Europe and the US, which are around 20% in this area, even though obviously there's been a drive towards electrification in those economies as well.
Let's clarify this point for folks who maybe aren't familiar with it. I mean, the energy that comes from fossil fuels, you need a lot more energy to get useful energy because the devices that are you combust the fossil fuel to create heat, then you take the heat and you make it do work. So it might be in an internal combustion engine, you make it turn wheels in transportation. It might be in a furnace in your home with natural gas. It might be an industrial furnace using coal. But whatever it is, you're only getting a small portion of the energy that's actually contained in that fossil fuel that does actual work. Whereas with electricity, it could be 75, 80, 90% because the devices are so much more efficient. So I guess your colleagues, Kingsmill Bond and Dan Walter, have argued this very eloquently. The real metric here is not the primary energy demand. That's misleading. It's how much energy is actually used at the source, and that's 30% in the economy. Correct? Have I explained that properly?
Yeah, exactly. Because what we want, essentially, for us, it's about focusing what humans want to do with energy, and humans don't want to, as a final means, humans don't want to burn a huge amount of coal. That's not the final aim. The final aim is always to move a car a certain distance. It's to heat your home by a certain amount of heat. It's to light your house with electricity. So those are the final aims. So when we look at changing a power system and changing an energy system, we should look at the efficiency of providing that service rather than just how much energy was in that original lump of coal that went through into that process. As an example, even within electricity generation, if you have a solar panel that puts out electricity, it goes directly into the grid. That's, let's say, a country like China now produces it's going to produce well over 1,000 terawatt hours of solar generation. If you would look at the equivalent for coal, on the primary energy side, that would be more than 3 times as much because you're looking at the energy that's stored in that coal that's being burned. Coal plants aren't necessarily that efficient. So you're losing a lot of that energy. So 2 to 3 times as much primary energy gets reduced to the same amount of over 1,000 terawatt hours then in the end.
Yeah, we've interviewed Professor Nick Eyre from Oxford, who's done some of the calculations, and by his estimates, if you electrified the entire global economy, your actual primary energy demand would be about half. Even though you'd use a lot more electricity, you actually would use only half the energy because now you wouldn't be wasting a lot of it. So
Exactly. So when you see a statistic that says renewables only make up 5% of global primary energy demand, we're not trying to get rid of the other 95%. The other 95% are actually much less.
let's talk about a couple of other areas of the economy that are contributing to electrification. And this one makes a lot of sense to me, heat and air conditioning ownership, because everywhere we're seeing, record heat during the summer and more cold in the winter. And it makes sense. We bought a heat pump 3 years ago, and it's amazingly efficient, much better. Our house is more comfortable all the time, and can't say enough good things about it. And it would make sense because China manufactures so many heat pumps that they would be not only making them at scale, but adopting them at scale.
Yeah, so heat pumps, obviously in the sort of European or the North American sense, are oftentimes seen as a slightly recent phenomenon, but the technology that's underlying heat pumps is very much something that's been established, and that's basically air conditioning. A heat pump is nothing but a very efficient air conditioner run in reverse. So and China is rolling this out both in the residential sector, but also in the industrial sector. This is a slightly newer element to it, is that industrial processes for heat are now also becoming feasible and especially becoming getting into a range where at current power prices that can be competitive with other sources of industrial heat like coal, for example. So there's really a shift in on the industrial side. But then, as you mentioned, on the residential side, there is an increasing need to provide temperature regulation. So that's both on the heating side, and heat pumps are very much the central part of heating electrification, but also on the cooling side. So air conditioning use, and this has been widely reported, in is something that Europeans will increasingly need as there are more heat waves in Europe. China has been the subject of incredible heat waves both this year and last year. We reported on it last year in our earlier this year in our global electricity review as well on the impact that additional high temperature heat in the summer months, especially in August and September, had on increased cooling demand. So that's more ACs running and those ACs running for longer and harder. So that's both an ownership growth, but at the same time also an increase in how much that AC is being used. And that's all down to that increased duration and severity of heat waves.
Let's also talk about something that is big in North America, and that's data centers, AI data centers, but also 5G networks in China. China is catching up, or some sources I've read actually think that China has caught the United States in terms of AI development and deployment. And the question is now is what kind of increase in load on power grids will data centers be? What is that an issue in China?
It certainly is, just like in the US, it's definitely a driver of increased electricity demand. One question here is if we are at a point where we can correctly judge what the increase in electricity demand actually will be. So with any nascent technology, and I'm hopefully not too adventurous when I'm saying that AI on that scale still feels like a relatively nascent technology within the last 2, 3 years. Often has significant shifts in its energy efficiency. So if models, for example, that are currently being trained and run on a certain level of energy demand, if those models are shifted to a system where it can run on a fifth, a tenth of that electricity demand, then we're looking at a vastly different projection for the next 10 years.
And I think the context here is OpenAI in the US, which is GPT, versus DeepSeek in China, which uses just a fraction of the same electricity, correct?
That's exactly right. And we've seen this with similar technologies, or at least adjacent technologies in the crypto sector, where the original or largest technology with Bitcoin is still very much an energy hungry cryptocurrency. But then others have even switched their underlying protocols to move away from, let's say, proof of work system, and have moved to a system that essentially reduces their electricity demand by over 90%. So in these really early onset technologies, these large leaps in efficiency are regularly observed. That doesn't mean that we don't have to slightly worry about what a future without efficiency improvement looks like. And that's where you're seeing the slightly panicked, slightly rushed planning, especially in very localized areas in the US, but also in China, on what that increased demand could look like. And this is one important point about data centers and AI, is that as opposed to something like heat pump demand, EV demand, which is usually just sort of focused on population centers but spread across the country, with data centers, we can have a specific electricity grid in the US, a specific city or region that suddenly sees its demand spike by 50, 60% over a few years. And that's a much harder challenge to to achieve if you're trying to balance your grid, you're trying to serve load to existing customers, you don't want to raise the electricity prices. A much harder challenge than a equally spread nationwide rollout of a new demand technology.
I want to ask you a question that's related to electrification, but also on the supply side on the power grid. And because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding here in North America about how China thinks about its power grid. And it uses a lot of gas, but it's only 3% of the power generation. And as I mentioned earlier, coal is 51%, down from I think 78, like 80% not that long ago. But it seems to me that what China is doing is rolling out renewables and some hydro and nuclear as fast as it can at scale, the biggest scale that it can. But at the same time, it's building high efficiency coal plants to replace older inefficient coal plants and it's introduced a capacity market to pay for the backup. And the end goal is a power grid that runs almost entirely off clean electricity, power generation, but coal is the backup. And is that the way the Chinese think about it?
That's exactly right. So it's not, as is sometimes characterized as, is not a system that's currently primarily focusing on coal generation. We obviously have this historical stock of coal generation and coal capacity in the country. This is exactly what we mean when we say there's an electricity transition, because obviously no country starts with 100% wind and solar. These are technologies that have become feasible over the last 2 decades and are now scaling faster than any other technology. So there is necessarily a transition. The the statistic that sometimes catches people out is China is still building new coal plants, right? These are obviously much more efficient plants, and they're replacing older plants. They can be run in a different configuration. For example, they don't necessarily need to run as baseload plants. They don't need to run 100% of the time to provide load efficiently or at cost. They can be run intermittently, the same way, for example, the US has a huge amount of gas peaker plants, which are quite inefficient actually. But yeah, so China is trying to shift its coal fleet to being much more flexible and being able to accommodate solar and wind. Now, you could ask, isn't that a really complicated process? Why not just use the coal directly? It's because solar and wind are so competitive both in the initial investment costs, and those investment costs spread over time, but also the operating costs. Obviously, there's no fuel cost associated with them. You don't have to pay for every single kilowatt hour that you get out of a solar plant or wind turbine. So they're so cost competitive that even running coal in this different configuration is overall a benefit to the power system. China is not doing this because they want to be really nice. They're doing it because it increases their energy security.
Let's talk about another aspect of this, which is geopolitical competition with the West, because they had the third plenum last year, and the three new things that are going to drive their economic policy are now solar PV, EVs, and batteries. And China sees this competition with the West as and its industrial manufacturing power is part of it's what drives its geopolitical strategies and vice versa. And so the scaling up of EVs and battery manufacturing capacity is because China now wants to move out into the global south. It wants to export more, and it essentially is taking its model in varying degrees to different countries. But that's what it's exporting, that electric strategy, that electric energy model. And would you agree? And if you do, to what extent are other countries, particularly in Asia, adopting the Chinese model?
Yeah, so the first one to that immediately comes to mind is India. So India initially started its solar rollout, for example, with panels that were imported from China. This did lead to some backlash. There's obviously somewhat of a competitive element, and also the necessity to build out a competitive manufacturing pipeline within India itself. It's a country that's rapidly developing on an economic level. So necessarily those nascent manufacturing hubs within India have a really strong desire to not be immediately overshadowed by solar panel exports that might be a lot cheaper in coming from China. So there were rules put in place for how projects could access financial assistance, for example, for solar projects in India, where those panels had to come from. And so that briefly led to a dip in solar panel imports from China. But now there is more solar panel manufacturing capacity that has been built up over the last 2 years. And as a result, we're already seeing record installations in India. For example, in the first half of the year, it was the second largest installer of solar panels worldwide. So 24 gigawatts were installed. That's still dwarfed by China's incredible 256 gigawatt number, but still it's ahead of the US. So India is the number two there, and this is partially a result of that domestic manufacturing strategy that's explicitly emphasized this clean technology as a big driver of development. And in that sense, India has caught onto it relatively quickly. And there's others now, sometimes with investment from China. For example, if you look at Brazil, EVs are now not just being exported to Brazil, but directly manufactured in Brazil. So BYD has a factory that has started with cars rolling off the line as of July. So it's not just exporting the product around the world, but as you said, it's kind of exporting the strategy around the world as well. And more countries will certainly catch on to this trend.
I want to finish up our interview this way, Nick, or with this question. And that is, I was looking at the 2024 numbers for increase in power generation and solar generation in China. And I was really surprised to notice that distributed solar was about half of that total capacity. So we're talking about rooftop solar primarily, maybe some community solar, I'm not sure. And a lot of it was from the industrial sector. It was self-generation behind the meter. You know, the factory might take cheap solar panels, cheap batteries, cheap digital controls, and essentially isolate themselves from the grid, use the grid as backup. Could you maybe comment on that trend?
Yeah, so it's like you say, it's rooftop solar for residential purposes, but it's also on businesses. And a successful strategy for solar rollout, in contrast to other fuel sources, can include distributed generation. And distributed generation have two benefits. The benefits are directly clear to the consumer. So in the sense of reduced electricity bills, it's very visible. So the install is you can directly see that you have made a change in your business operations. Is literally on your rooftop. So when that change in electricity bills or that reduction comes in, you can directly tie it to an action that you've taken. But it's also the result of really ambitious investment and incentive programs that the Chinese government has rolled out over the last few years, especially for businesses. There were projects on sort of, in translation, they were sort of called whole county rooftop PV, where really targeted into specific areas to get a lot of PV rolled out in those areas. And that reduces a few complexities as well, oftentimes with larger projects, so utility scale projects. You have a different level of grid planning that's required. You might have a different land area requirement. And a rooftop is obviously a land area that's not required for any other purpose apart from providing shielding for your house. So adding an additional use case for an area that's already has as a paved over surface, for example, is an excellent way to make more efficient use of the land that's already in use. So it has all kinds of benefits, and we're seeing the same strategy and the same share of distributed generation replicated in other countries that have gone big on solar. In Germany, there's a huge rooftop solar market. The UK has a big rooftop solar market. In Brazil, a huge share of the big rise in solar generation that's happened over the last 3-4 years has been on rooftops as well. So this is a strategy that has been replicated again and again. And then to take it one step further, it doesn't even have to be an industrial strategy outset by the state. And Pakistan is a really good example for this, where the incentive to install rooftop solar came from a grid that is underserving its customers, frequent blackouts, high electricity prices. So customers can take matters into their own hand. And we've seen almost a world-leading pace of solar deployment in Pakistan, primarily or almost entirely. So over 90% of those installations going directly onto rooftops and onto businesses, because there's a direct need for accessing electricity generation at cheaper prices.
Nick, thank you very much for this. It's been fascinating, and we're going to come back to you as Ember rolls out more reports. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.